The smoke was a solid wall that had eaten the sky. It tasted of pine and panic. Below it, the town of Promise emptied itself onto the dusty eastern road, a frantic scramble of wagons and shouting men. At the head of the chaos was Silas Sterling, his face the color of a fresh bruise, yelling at everyone and no one. He, who owned the most, had the most to lose, and so his fear was the loudest. But the fire did not listen to land deeds. It was a roaring, galloping beast of orange and black, and it was coming for them all. It had already devoured the dry western range, Sterling's prime cattle grazing, and was now chewing through the brittle chaparral that ringed the town like a thorny collar. Then it reached the edge of Alara's land. And it stopped. Not all at once, not like a lantern blown out. It was a more shocking thing to witness. The 100-foot wall of flame charged the invisible line of her property and seemed to trip. The roar lessened to a hungry grumble. The inferno, starved of fuel, broke against a wide, barren belt of earth and stone, splitting and flowing weakly around the obstacle, its terrible heart cut out. The people on the road, halfway to ruin, stopped their flight. They turned. They stared. In the hellish glow, they could see it clearly, a perfect, stark demarcation. On one side, a world on fire. On the other, the worthless, scrub-chewed acreage of the goat girl. And there, standing by her small cabin, unmoving, was Alara herself, a silhouette against the lesser flames, watching the monster die at her feet. 1 year earlier, she had been a fool. The whole town agreed. She had come into possession of the sorriest 100 acres in the valley, a patch of land so choked with greasewood, manzanita, and poison oak that the dirt beneath it hadn't seen the sun in a century. It was a vertical tangle of brush on a slope of rock and clay, good for nothing but rattlesnakes and regret. Silas Sterling, whose fine ranch bordered the property, had made her an offer out of what he called pity. "It's a kindness, miss," he'd said, his voice smooth as butter. "A young woman alone, you can't work this. No one can. I'll give you $50 for the deed, more than it'll ever be worth to you." Alara had looked at his soft hands, and then at the bristling, hostile land. She had almost nothing to her name but a stubborn stillness she'd inherited from her father. She thanked Mr. Sterling for his time and showed him the gate. The mockery began that day. It was quiet at first, whispers in the mercantile, pitying looks from women who thought she was touched by some lonely madness. Why wouldn't she take the money? What could she possibly do with a place even the coyotes circled with suspicion? Then she bought the goats, and the whispers turned to open laughter. She bought them from a man whose spirit had been broken by the dust and the debt. He was leaving the territory with a wagon that sagged as much as his shoulders. He had 57 goats, a raggedy herd of Alpines and Nubians with intelligent, troublesome eyes. They were considered a plague by cattlemen, destructive browsers that ruined good pasture. To the farmers, they were a joke. "You can't eat a goat's milk and you can't shear its attitude," was the common wisdom. Alara spent nearly the last of her money on the whole flock. The man stared at her, then at the cash in his hand, a look of dawning relief on his face. "God bless you, miss," he'd stammered. "But what in heaven's name for?" She just nodded toward her impenetrable land. When the herd arrived, a chaotic river of brown and white and black, the town of Promise turned out to watch the spectacle. They clattered up the road, bleeding and jostling, their hooves striking sparks on the stones. Men leaned on the fence posts of the saloon and shook their heads. "She's gone and bought herself 57 mouths of trouble," Sterling was right. Girls got rocks in her head. The only person who didn't laugh was Old Man Hemlock. He lived on a small, neat plot on the other side of town, an immigrant from a country of rock and sun that no one could pronounce. He grew olives and herbs in soil everyone else called useless. He walked with a slight limp and smelled of thyme and pipe smoke. He came to her fence the day after the goats arrived and watched them for a long time, his eyes narrowed not with judgment, but with appraisal. Alara was mending a stretch of fence, her hands already showing the first signs of the work. "They are good animals," Hemlock said, his voice a low rumble, accented and slow. "They have the hard mouth." The hungry mouth, Alara paused, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist. She waited. He pointed a gnarled finger toward the dense chaparral. "In my country, we have a saying. The hungry mouth is the best axe." He looked at her, a long, searching look. "But it is a slow axe. It requires patience. Alara looked from his weathered face to the sea of brush, then to the restless, chewing herd. Patience was all she had left. She had spent her money not on animals, but on 57 small, four-legged axes. The arithmetic of it was simple and brutal. 100 acres of worthless land. 57 goats. One woman alone. The town saw a fool. Old Man Hemlock saw a beginning. The work began before the sun. Each morning, Alara rose in the pre-dawn chill, her breath pluming in the lantern light. The first task was always the fence. Using what lumber she could afford and wire she salvaged, she sectioned off a quarter-acre of the densest brush. It was a punishing task. The ground was rocky, resisting the post-hole digger with a jarring clang. The manzanita was slick and hard as iron, its branches twisting together in a defiant web. She'd drive the goats into the enclosure, latch the gate, and their work would begin. And it was work. From the moment they entered, a great chewing commenced. They were systematic, relentless. They started with the low-hanging leaves of the scrub oaks, standing on their hind legs to strip them clean. They devoured the poison oak with a relish that bordered on comical, their supposed poison proving to be nothing more than a savory salad. They ate bark. They ate twigs. They ate the thorny, bitter greasewood that even insects avoided. They were not grazers, like cattle, seeking soft grass. They were browsers, living demolition crews. At the end of the day, the quarter-acre looked savaged. By the end of the third day, it looked skeletal, the woody structures of the larger bushes picked clean. By the end of the week, they had consumed everything green, leaving only the thick, dead stalks. This was Alara's part. She would enter the pen with a heavy billhook and a Swede saw. For hours, she would cut the dead, brittle skeletons of the brush, dragging them into massive piles to dry in the sun. It was back-breaking labor that left her hands raw and her muscles screaming. After she cleared the deadwood, she moved the fence. She'd drag the posts and roll the wire to the next quarter-acre, and the process would start all over again. A small boy from town started to watch her. His name was Finn, a scrawny child with eyes that missed nothing. He'd sit on a boulder outside the fence for hours, utterly silent. One day, he pointed to the big, bearded billy goat who always seemed to be in charge. "What's his name?" he asked. Alara, hauling a tangle of manzanita, paused. "He doesn't have one, he should," Finn said, with the grave certainty of childhood. "He looks like a general," the name stuck. Soon, Finn had named them all. There was Patches, a goat with a splotch over one eye, Shadow, who was sleek and black, a grumpy old nanny named Grumbles, and a pair of inseparable kids he called Salt and Pepper. The goats, ridiculous to everyone else, became characters in a slow-moving play. They were a flock of 57 comedians and laborers, and their gentle, situational irony was not lost on Alara. Watching the fearsome-looking general delicately nibble a single flower off a thistle was a private joke that lightened the crushing weight of the work. Day after day, week after week, the pattern held. Fence, browse, clear, move. A patch of land the size of a town lot, stripped bare every 7 days. Alara kept a ledger, a small book where she practiced her arithmetic of survival. She tracked the square footage cleared, the cost of wire, the slow depletion of her sack of flour. The numbers were stark. She was in a race against winter, a race against hunger. Her progress felt agonizingly slow. From the road, her 100 acres still looked like an impenetrable wilderness. The small patches of cleared land were invisible from a distance, lost in the vastness of the brush. The town's mockery continued, settling into a kind of permanent, low-grade pity. "Still playing with her goats," the men at the saloon would say. Poor girl Silas Sterling would sometimes ride by on his fine horse, pausing to look over her fence line. He never spoke to her, but his expression was one of smug satisfaction, the look of a man watching a foregone conclusion unfold. He was waiting for her to break. He was waiting for the first snow, for her to come to him, beaten and desperate, ready to sign the deed for his insulting $50. One person alone. The phrase echoed in her mind in the quiet evenings, when her body ached and the loneliness was a physical presence in her small cabin. One person alone could not do this. That was the verdict of the world. But as she looked out her window, she saw the 57 dark shapes of the goats, settled for the night, their quiet chewing a soft, reassuring percussion in the dark. It was not one person alone. It was 58, and they were winning. She kept her small victories secret, banking them like a coal held low under ash, waiting for the right moment to let it breathe. The first victory was the soil. Where the goats had cleared, the land was not barren. After she raked away the last of the woody debris, she was left with mineral soil, dark and rich with the droppings of 57 animals. She took a handful of it to Old Man Hemlock. He crumbled it in his fingers, brought it to his nose, and nodded slowly. "This is good," he said. The land was sleeping. "Now it wakes up." He gave her a small pouch of seeds, a hardy clover from his homeland. "For them," he said, nodding toward the goats. "And for the earth. You give back what you take." This is the way. She learned the language of her land, a language others had forgotten how to read. She saw where the water seeped after a rare rain, marking the spots for a future well. She learned the subtle shift in the color of the chemise that signaled the driest, most flammable sections. Her hands, once soft, grew rough as bark, calloused and strong. They were hands that knew the price of an acre. By June, the change was undeniable. A full 10 acres, a wide swath running along the base of her property, was completely clear. The brush had been replaced by a field of low, green clover, dotted with the wildflowers that had sprung from long dormant seeds. The goats, rotated back onto this new pasture, grew fat and sleek. Their coats shone. The nannies, well-fed and content, began to kid. The flock grew from 57 to nearly 80. The sight was jarring. The rest of the valley was turning a uniform, dusty brown under the relentless sun, but Alara's land had a belt of impossible green at its hem. People noticed. The laughter on the road quieted. It was replaced by a confused silence, a reluctant curiosity. A drover moving a herd of sheep north stopped his wagon, his eyes fixed on her animals. "Those are the finest-looking goats I've seen in this territory," he said, leaning on her fence. "You raise 'em for milk?" "No," Alara said, her voice steady. "For clearing." The man looked from the healthy goats to the cleared land behind them, then to the choking brush beyond. A slow understanding dawned on his face. He wasn't a cattleman blinded by prejudice. He was a man of business. He saw not a woman's folly, but a result. He ended up buying 10 of her yearlings for a price that made her gasp. It was more money than Sterling had offered for her entire property. She held the coins in her palm, the solid weight of her vindication. That night, she bought a new sack of flour, a side of bacon, and a small bag of candy for Finn, who now spent every afternoon helping her, his thin arms surprisingly strong. The transaction at the mercantile was a quiet affair. The storekeeper, who had once been among the mockers, counted her change with a new, respectful slowness. Being right was its own kind of reply, and it needed no volume. The news of the sale traveled through Promise like a grass fire. It reached Silas Sterling that evening. He rode out to her property again the next morning. This time, he dismounted. He leaned against the fence, trying to affect the same casual air as before, but a new tension sharpened the lines around his eyes. "I see you've been busy," he said, his gaze sweeping over the cleared land. It was a much larger patch than he'd realized. He had assumed she was failing. Instead, she had taken a worthless thing and, through some stubborn alchemy he couldn't comprehend, was turning it into value. The land was still steep, still rocky, but it was no longer unusable. It was becoming pasture. His pasture. "It's a fire risk, you know," Sterling said, his tone shifting to one of false concern. "All these piles of dry brush. A single spark, and it all goes up. You could lose everything. The town could be in danger." Alara looked at the massive, neatly stacked brush piles, set far back from the cleared land, drying in the sun. She had a plan for them. They were not a risk, they were future fuel. "I'm managing it," she said. Her calm was a wall he couldn't find a way over. It infuriated him. "A young woman alone can't manage a thing like this," he insisted, the condescension returning to his voice like a bad habit. "You've done well, I'll admit. Surprised us all. You've proven your point. Now it's time to be sensible. I'll double my offer. $100. Cash. You can walk away with a profit and leave this dangerous work to men who understand it. $100. For 10 acres of new pasture, a healthy, breeding flock of goats, and the promise of 90 more acres to come. The offer was no longer just an insult. It was a theft. "No. Thank you, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice as plain and unadorned as the earth at her feet. The price is not right. His face tightened, the false warmth curdling into something cold and hard. You'll regret this, he hissed. A thing is only worth what someone is willing to pay. And I'm the only buyer for this rock pile. He mounted his horse and rode away, the dust pluming behind him like an angry thought. The town was divided now. Some saw what the drover had seen, a result. They saw a woman who had worked a small miracle. Others, loyal to Sterling or simply unable to admit they were wrong, sided with him. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. The whispers started again, but this time they were laced with a different poison. Not pity, but envy. She's hoarding that land, she got lucky. Sterling's right. It's a danger. A proud, frightened farmer, whose own corn was withering on the stalk, stopped her on the road. His name was Cobb, a man whose hands were as hard as hers, but whose eyes held a desperate, hunted look. That clover, he said, his voice raspy. My cows are starving. Sell me some of that seed. Alara looked at his thin face, the pride warring with the hunger. She knew what the seed was worth. She could have named a high price. Instead, she nodded toward his wagon. I don't have seed to sell, but you can take a wagon load of the cuttings for your cows. No charge. The man stared at her, speechless. He had been one of the loudest mockers. Now, faced with a generosity he hadn't earned, he could only nod, his eyes suddenly bright with unshed tears. He did not yet know it, but she was not just feeding his cows. She was building a different kind of fence, one made not of wire, but of obligation and gratitude. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The sky turned a pale, hazy white and stayed that way for weeks. The creek that marked the edge of town slowed to a trickle, then vanished, leaving a scar of cracked mud. The wells grew shallower. The great oaks on the valley floor, their roots deep, began to drop their leaves as if it were autumn. It was a drought that scraped the land down to the bone. Sterling's vast cattle pastures, overgrazed for years, became fields of brown dust and brittle, yellowed stalks. His cattle, hundreds of them, grew thin, their ribs showing like wreckage. They wandered listlessly, their lowing a constant, mournful complaint. The whole valley was tinder. A dropped match, a spark from a horseshoe, a bolt of lightning from a dry storm. Any of it could end them. The tension in Promise was thick enough to taste. Fights broke out in the saloon over nothing. Neighbors who had known each other for 20 years eyed one another's wells with suspicion. Hunger changes a town. Fear changes it faster. Only Alara's land seemed to hold out. The wide, cleared belt she had carved was a firebreak, a term most people in the valley had never had cause to use. The clover, with its deeper roots, was still green, an emerald promise in a dying world. Her goats, browsers by nature, were untroubled by the lack of grass. They continued their work, pushing the line of cleared earth steadily up the slope. She had started to use the dried brush piles, burning them carefully on calm nights inside a ring of cleared stone, creating heaps of nutrient-rich ash to work back into the soil. She was tending her land like a garden. Old Man Hemlock would visit, his eyes on the pale, cloudless sky. It is coming, he said one afternoon, his voice grim. He was not a man given to dramatics. He was reading the signs, just as she was. The frantic activity of the squirrels, the way the air felt thin and electric. Your hungry mouths have done their work, he told her, looking at the wide, bare ground the goats had made. Now we see if it was enough. The antagonist was not Sterling, not anymore. His greed was a small, human thing. The real enemy was the heat, the dryness, the vast, careless indifference of the sky. The arithmetic in her ledger changed. It was no longer about profit and loss. It was about survival. Feet of firebreak, gallons of water in her rain barrel. The number of days until the autumn rains might come, or might not. One person alone against the sky. It felt that way again, but when she looked at the 50-foot wide band of bare earth and rock her goats had carved between the town and the wild, she felt a flicker of something more than hope. It was readiness. The fire began on a Tuesday, with a crack of lightning in the bone-dry hills 5 miles west. There was no rain with it, only the fatal spark. By noon, the plume of smoke was visible from town, a dirty thumbprint on the pale sky. By 3, it was a cauliflower of churning gray and black, and the wind, a hot, steady gale from the west, was pushing it directly toward them. The bell in the town's small church began to ring, not a joyful peal, but a frantic, desperate clang. Panic, once a low hum, became a roar. Wagons were loaded in a frenzy. Possessions of a lifetime were abandoned for the things that mattered most: children, water barrels, a side of bacon. The road east became a river of fear. Silas Sterling was the loudest of all. He and his ranch hands rode through the town, their faces streaked with soot, trying to drive his skeletal cattle before the flames. But the terrified animals scattered, running back toward the fire, their instincts fatally confused. Sterling screamed, his voice raw with fury and despair, a man watching his fortune turn to ash on the wind. Alara did not run. She walked to the edge of her property, the border between her patient work and the world's chaos, and she watched it come. Finn was with her, his small hand gripping hers, his face pale, but his eyes wide with a strange, terrible awe. Her goats were safe, enclosed in the far eastern corner of the clover field, calm and chewing, oblivious to the apocalypse. The fire was a living thing. It did not just burn, it hunted. It leaped from treetop to treetop, a crown fire of impossible speed. It spawned fire whirls, cyclones of flame that danced and spun, throwing embers a quarter-mile ahead of the main front. The sound was a constant, deafening roar, the sound of 1,000 freight trains. The heat washed over them in waves, stealing the breath from their lungs. The edge of the chaparral exploded into flame, the resinous manzanita and chemise burning with the violence of gunpowder. The wall of fire, 100 feet high, raced across the last few hundred yards of brush. This was the moment, the culmination of a year of labor, of mockery, of quiet belief. The result of 57 hungry mouths and one woman's stubbornness. It was all theory until now, all faith. The fire hit her line. It hit the 50-foot-wide belt of earth, rock, and low-green clover, and it starved. The great wall of flame collapsed as if its legs had been cut out from under it. The roar dropped to a furious hiss. Tongues of fire licked out across the bare ground, tasted nothing but dirt and stone, and died. Embers, thrown by the wind, landed in the green clover and sputtered out, their deadly heat quenched by the living green. The fire front, its momentum broken, its heart starved, could not jump the gap. It was a simple, physical fact, a truth written on the land. The townspeople on the road had stopped. Their flight had become a vigil. They watched, transfixed, as the inferno that was meant to destroy them broke apart. The fire, blunted, split into two smaller fronts that flanked Alara's property, moving north and south, away from the town. Its direct assault on Promise had failed. The danger was not over, but the killing blow had been parried. A collective sigh, a gasp of disbelief, went through the crowd. They lowered their children from the wagons. They stared, their faces illuminated by the dying flames, at the impossible island of safety that had appeared in their path. And they stared at the woman standing at its edge. In the smoky twilight, a silence fell over the valley, broken only by the crackle of the receding flames and the distant, panicked lowing of Sterling's lost cattle. The fire had burned all the way to his back door, consuming his pastures, his fences, his barns. It had stopped short of his house, but his wealth, his power, his pride, all of it was a smoldering ruin. He staggered out of the smoke, his face a mask of black soot, his fine clothes torn and burned. He saw the crowd staring, not at him, but past him, at Alara's land. He saw the miracle, and his face twisted with a baffled rage. "It was the wind," he shouted, his voice cracking. The wind shifted. She got lucky, but no one was listening. They had all felt the wind, hot and steady on their faces, driving the fire straight into that line. They had all seen it stop. They knew it wasn't luck. It was a goat-chewed, hand-cleared, 50-foot-wide swath of truth. Old Man Hemlock made his way through the crowd and stood beside Alara. He looked at the scorched earth on one side of the line and the living green on the other. He put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "The hungry mouth is the best axe," he said, his voice soft but clear in the sudden quiet. "It cuts the path for what comes next." What came next was a slow, dawning wave of shame and gratitude. The people of Promise turned their wagons around. They didn't go back to their homes, not yet. They came, one by one, and in small family groups, to the edge of her property. They just stood there, looking at the woman they had called a fool, the girl they had pitied, the stubborn loner who had, by following her own quiet logic, saved them. The arithmetic had been proven correct. One woman, plus 57 goats, was greater than one fire. It was a sum no one in Promise would ever forget. In the days that followed, the smoke cleared, revealing a landscape of black and gray. The fire had burned itself out against the rocky ridges to the north and the wider river to the south. The town was an oasis, spared by the thinnest of margins. Surrounding it was a sea of ash. Sterling's land was a desolate moonscape. Cobb's farm was gone. Half a dozen smaller homesteads were nothing but blackened chimneys and warped iron. The people who had lost everything had nowhere to go. They began to gather near Alara's fence line, drawn to the only patch of green for miles. They were humbled, hungry, and afraid. Alara watched them from her cabin. She could have turned them away. She could have reminded them of their laughter, their scorn. She could have sold them food and water at a fortune's price, for she had a deep well and a larder, and they had nothing. Greed would have been justified as business. Pride would have been understandable. She did neither. She opened her gate. She led Cobb's few remaining cows into her clover pasture. She set up a soup kitchen near her cabin, using the vegetables from her small garden and the bacon she had bought with the goat money. She offered water from her well to anyone who asked. She did not speak of the past. She did not ask for apologies. Her generosity was as plain and steady as her work had been. It was not a performance. It was simply who she was. Being right was its own reward. Being kind was its own reason. Silas Sterling, his fortune gone and his pride in tatters, left town before the week was out. He sold his scorched land for pennies on the dollar to a consortium of the very farmers he'd once lorded it over, men now bound together by shared loss and a new, hard-won sense of community. They had learned a lesson written in smoke and ash. The land did not care about a man's name, only about his stewardship. Finn became Alara's permanent shadow, the foreman of the goat herd, which he managed with a solemn dignity that belied his years. The goats, heroes in their own right, became the town's mascots. No one called them a plague anymore. They were saviors with ridiculous beards and intelligent eyes. When the first autumn rains finally came, the water ran off the baked, barren ground of the burned scar in destructive black rivers. But on Alara's land, the soil she had nurtured drank it in. Within weeks, a faint green fuzz appeared on the cleared slopes. Life was returning, first to her small corner, an island of resilience. The town council came to her that winter. They asked her to teach them. They wanted to know about the goats, about the clover, about the fire breaks. They offered her a contract, a handsome one, to run her goat brigades across the public lands that ringed the town, to create a permanent, living defense. She named her price. It was a fair one, not a gouge. It was the price of wire and feed and a decent wage for the half-dozen young men and women, Finn among them, who now worked for her. Her vindication was not in wealth or power, but in the quiet authority she now held. She had taught the town a new kind of arithmetic, where the worth of a thing was not what it looked like, but what it did. The final image of the story of the Goat Girl of Promise was not one of fire, but of water and green. It was the image of Alara, standing on the highest ridge of her property, the land now almost completely cleared, looking down at the town she had saved. Below, the goats moved like a slow, patient tide, their hungry mouths still the best axes in the world, clearing the path not just from the brush, but for everything that was to come.